So our Bible study topic today is what do we need to know about Judaism, part 1. This is part of an ongoing series of studies about world religions. The last couple of weeks we did Christianity, part 1 and 2. And today we start with Judaism, and we'll do the rest of that next week. And then Islam, the 3 Abrahamic religions. Then we will move on to Buddhism and finally Hinduism, finishing up just before Thanksgiving on this series. So I think it's important that we are aware of other religious faiths, especially those that interact with our own faith, and have a little more knowledge about them. So Judaism is an ethnic group as well as a religious group. Biblical Judaism, the Judaism that we meet through the Bible, for Christians what we call the Old Testament, for Jews what we call the Bible. The fundamental issue is one of tension in Judaism. The tension in identity between being a peculiar people, that is a unique group of people set apart for ministry, but also a group of people that is called to be a light to the nations. And those are two very different things. Being a peculiar people can be a matter of being set apart, different, and yet being a light to the nations means being open to and interacting with the nations. When he was asked to give the essence of Judaism, the famous Rabbi Hillel said this: "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man." Judaism, that's pretty good. It almost sounds like part of a golden rule. Judaism in the Hebrew Bible is different in many ways than Judaism today. Judaism in the Bible has developed, or Judaism today has developed quite a bit since the biblical period. Judaism is named for Judah, who is Israel's son. In the Bible, I'm just going to go through for the next few minutes and give you a bit of an overview of what the Bible tells us about Judaism and its development and its identity. So the Bible begins with the book of Genesis, literally the book of beginnings, and the first 11 chapters are stories that fit into the literary category of myth. Myth meaning stories about the origins of things. How did things happen the way they are? How do we explain life being the way it is? There's a priestly account of creation. That's Genesis chapter 1 through the very first few chapters, verses of chapter 2. And this story was probably written down by priests to be used as part of a worship liturgy. It has that kind of balanced format to it. And it was, in many ways, a rewriting of the Babylonian creation story. The Hebrew version of the story was probably written down as late as the time of Babylonian captivity, maybe the 6th century or so BC or BCE. BC is a way of the church talking about the time, meaning before Christ, and BCE is the way that scholars tend to talk about that time before the Common Era. But the numbers are all the same, so I may go back and forth. The Babylonian creation story is called the Enuma Elish, and it's about a god named Marduk. And this god Marduk attacked and killed his mother, who was a goddess named Tiamat. She was the goddess of the sea, salt water. And Marduk was a god of the clouds and the sky and the air. And so he became the chief of the gods. And in the Babylonian story, creation takes place through violence, through domination, through greed. And the patterns of creation in the Genesis 1 story, though they follow the rough order of the Enuma Elish story, But in the Hebrew story, God speaks things into being, and all is considered good. So it's a much more loving version of the story. But there are other creation stories from the Hebrew history. There's the story of the Garden of Eden. Several chapters on that, Adam and Eve and that creation and what happened with all of that. And then life east of Eden after they were not allowed to return to the garden. And the stories of Adam and Eve's descendants, Cain and Abel, their first two sons, Seth, their third son. And it goes on with how those stories kind of developed. And then we come to the long story of Noah and the ark, Genesis chapters 5 through 10, and also the stories of Noah's descendants. Following that story of Noah is the story of the Tower of Babel. Babel is probably related to the word for Babylon. And this story of the Tower of Babel lists all the descendants of Shem, Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Shem is according to the story, is the father of the Shemites or the Semites, the Semitic people leading down to Abraham. After the story of the Tower of Babel, once we get into the end of chapter 11, the beginning of chapter 12 of Genesis, there's a section of stories that we call sagas. Lots of literary types in the Bible. And these sagas trace the stories of the patriarchs, Adam, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their wives, mainly Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel, Joseph, and then Moses, and so this part of the story kind of traces how the Semitic Hebrew people got to be. We follow Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who became Israel. They're from roughly a time in history, which is different than the 11 chapters before, probably somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BC. God has a covenant with Abraham, and the 12 tribes of Israel developed from that, the 12 sons of Jacob. So you have Abraham, you have Isaac, you have Jacob, and Jacob has the 12 sons, and those are the children of Israel. Now, no one knows for sure if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were three historical people or three prototypical people, three representatives of tribal groups that helped to form what became the Hebrew people. But in our story, we have them as patriarchs. And then the 12 tribes of Israel, and they end up having a time of what's called sojourning in Egypt. They live in the land of Goshen, are taken into slavery by the Egyptians, and then they leave Egypt in what's called the Exodus, led by Moses. And that is a seminal event in the life of the Hebrew people. There is no clear historic record outside of the Bible about this Exodus, but that's not completely surprising. If it were a historical event, then the Egyptians probably would have covered it up, because a mass escape of slaves from Egypt, the killing of Pharaoh in a flood, all of those miracles by the gods of the Hebrews, that would not have been anything that the Egyptians would have wanted to keep in their history. But we just don't know. So after this Exodus time, when the Hebrew people spent time in the wilderness on their way to the promised land, they received the law, and the law from God on Mount Sinai, and ended up in the promised land. Joshua, who was Moses' assistant, Joshua took over for Moses after Moses' death. And the story of Joshua is the story of the conquest of the promised land. It's a story of holy war as the will of God. It tells of this story, and yet what we find later, especially in the book of the Judges, is that things probably were not quite as clear and definitive as Joshua makes them out to be in terms of Israel taking over the promised land of Palestine. Following the death of Joshua, we have the beginning of a period called the Judges. And this period had a series of charismatic figures that rose to leadership in times of crisis. And the crisis for Israel was generally precipitated by their lack of faith, their falling away, worshiping the gods of the local community around them, and then suffering because of that, often militarily. They were oppressed. And then there would be this charismatic leader called a judge who would arise among them, organize them, get the army together. They would throw off the oppressors, and then they would settle down for the rest of the life of that judge, and usually some period of a multiple or a division of 40 years. And then following the death of that judge, they would slowly relapse into their faithless posture, and the whole cycle would repeat itself. The most famous judges were Samson and finally Samuel, who also became the first of the prophets. Following the period of the judges was what we call the time of the monarchy. Saul was the first king of Israel. He was less than successful. His lack of success was blamed on his lack of faith in God. He was succeeded by David and Solomon, though there is no real historic record that we know of these kings, especially of Saul and David. There's plenty of reason to believe that they did exist. And Solomon built the great temple that bore his name, Solomon's Temple, in the 900s BC. But following Solomon's death, the kingdom of Israel divided in two. There was the northern 10 tribes of the 12 called Israel, and then there were the southern 2 tribes called Judah, which also included a portion of the tribe of Benjamin. The northern tribe, the northern nation of Israel, was defeated and exiled by the Assyrian Empire in about 722 BC. They never did return, and what came in their place became the Samaritans that we know of from the New Testament times. Judah, the southern kingdom, was exiled by the Empire of Babylon in about 587 or 586 BC. And during that period, Jerusalem itself and the temple, Solomon's temple, were destroyed. While in Babylonian captivity, Babylon itself was conquered by the empire of Persia and Media, and that was about 539 or so BC. And the enlightened monarch of the Persian Empire actually sent people home. They offered all the exiles to be able to go home with certain provisions. About 10% of the Israelites did actually return to Palestine, to Jerusalem. Eventually others returned. But this whole process began in the middle of the 6th century, the 500s. And after this first group returned to Jerusalem, there was developing a diaspora, that is a more or less permanent community of Jews living outside of the Holy Land. And but in Jerusalem, they began to rebuild the second temple in about 539, and they finished it, though it was a very humble structure, in 516 BC. A good rest of the part of the Hebrew Bible recounts some of the stories of the post-exilic nation of Israel, the Second Temple period. The Israelites were vassals under the Persian Empire for close to 200 years until Alexander the Great, the Greek conqueror, conquered the Persian Empire about 331 BC. During that same period of time, the Hebrew scripture, the Torah, and the prophets were finally written down, and they were translated into Greek, which became the dominant language of the time. This translation of the Hebrew scripture became known and is still known as the Septuagint. A funny word, but it's based on the number 7 or 70. And the legend is that there were 70 scholars that took the Hebrew scripture to translate it into Greek, and all 70 came up with exactly the same translation. And that's why it's called the Septuagint. The abbreviation is LXX in Roman numerals, meaning 70. After Alexander's death, Palestine was ruled by first the Ptolemies. These were the descendants of one of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy, who ruled Egypt in that area. And then later by the Seleucids, who were Syrians. And then within Israel, the group that developed and had some power were the priests, because the other groups kind of ceased to exist. And the leader, this priestly family, the family that was the leaders of this, were the Hasmoneans, 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 and they were led by Judas Maccabeus. And Judas rebelled, led a rebellion against the last of the Seleucid kings. Antiochus Epiphanes was his name. This was about 160, in the 160s BC. And this overthrow and the period of that time gave rise to the Jewish festival we call Hanukkah. And it had to do with abuses of the temple by the Seleucids and a celebration of the return of worship in the temple and return of God in the temple. And that Feast of Hanukkah, or Feast of Dedication, was a celebration that originated with the Maccabean rebellion. There was a quasi-independent Jewish state by about the 140s BC, but that didn't last long, because the Roman Empire came, the Roman legion came and conquered and controlled Jerusalem in about the year 64 to 63. Herod the Great reigned from 43 BC to 4 BC, and he was responsible for greatly expanding the work on the Second Temple, making it far larger and more grand than the Temple of Solomon had ever been. And during this time, probably during the last of the reign of Herod the Great, Jesus was born. There are certain themes in the Bible about the Jewish nation. The first theme was the monarchy, how it slowly developed, came into being, and then the themes of exile and post-exile. These kind of covered. The general theme was a movement from slavery to freedom, from Egypt to the Promised Land. In Judaism, the themes of Exodus, wilderness, and the Promised Land were basic. And in the various festivals and worships of the worship of the Jewish faith, the collective memory of the people is relived, and the past is relived. The liberation or the Exodus from Egypt is relived each year at the Passover festival. The tradition, the souls of all future Jews were present at Mount Sinai with Moses. There's annual festivals that mourn the destruction of the temples. And the promises to the patriarchs are considered still binding on God, so God still watches out for the people. Judaism has some 4,000 years of tradition, but that tradition is still being renewed and expanded. The history and development is marked by several festivals. I mentioned Passover. This Passover festival was originally two separate events. First evening is the passing over of the angel of death. That's a one-day festival. And then the 7-day festival of unleavened bread, which commemorates as they left from Egypt following the Passover. They brought unleavened bread, and it would rise while they traveled, and would bake while they were walking through the sunlight. Another major festival, that Passover Feast of Unleavened Bread is now one festival, just called Passover, an 8-day pilgrimage festival. In many periods of history, including when Jesus was alive, Passover was one of 3 festivals in which Jewish people were pretty much required to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, to celebrate. The second was called the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. It celebrates the 50th day after the barley sheaf ceremony at the beginning of Passover. It's a time of the bringing of first fruits. It's an agricultural festival, and later became a celebration of the Torah itself. We have just come through a New Year's celebration, one of several New Year's celebrations in Judaism, called Rosh Hashanah. This is a 2-day celebration that begins the agricultural year. During this, God is reestablished each year as the true King of Israel. The ram's horn, shofar, is blown, and that begins the high holy days. And immediately upon that is the Day of Atonement, of the festival of Yom Kippur, the 10th day from New Year's. It marks the conclusion, the culmination in many ways, of the high holy days, time of fasting and prayer. Traditionally, it's the day that the high priest would enter, when the temple was standing, enter the Holy of Holies and open the Ark of the Covenant. The Torah scrolls are read. The ceremony of 2 goats is offered, one a sin offering and the other the scapegoat, and now prayer and penitence for atonement. And then the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, is how I've most often heard it pronounced, marks the 40-year sojourn in the wilderness during the Exodus. It is an 8 to 9 day celebration that follows the atonement and celebrates all God's providences. And then finally there is Purim, Purim, that is based on the story of the book of Esther. Now, during New Testament times, there were basically 4 groups of Jews that we can figure out from the New Testament stories, primarily the gospel stories. One were the Pharisees. They were a consistent antagonist toward Jesus. Pharisees were not priests. They were biblical scholars, doctors of the law. Then there were the Sadducees, and they were priests. They focused on their work in the temple, the work of sacrifices, butchering the animals in the right way for sacrifices, etc. Obviously, when the temple was destroyed, the work of the Sadducees suddenly disappeared, as did they. The third group were the Essenes. These are the people that we associate with the Dead Sea cult and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then the final 4th group were called the Zealots. And this was a group that advocated armed rebellion from all of the oppressors, especially at this time, against Rome. And the Essenes went out of existence because, the Essenes went out of existence because they were largely celibate and just didn't reproduce. And then, of course, the Roman legion came through and killed many of them. And the Zealots, many to most of them, died violent deaths at the hands of the Romans. During this period, there was a gradual emergence of a 3-part canon of sacred scripture. Now, we call it, using an acronym, the Tanakh, Tanakh, and that stands for the Torah, that is the law, the prophets, the Nevi'im, and the writings, the Ketuvim. And these 3 dimensions of Jewish scripture actually were closed as a canon in the year 214 of the Common Era, that is AD. And there was a council, a Jewish council called the Council of Jamnia, and but all the books were written in the BC period, but they were closing the canon means that no more writings could be added to it at that point. So I'm going to just say a word about post-biblical Judaism. This is just immediately post-biblical. There were gradual changes during the Second Temple period from around 6 BC, 6th century, 500s, which was the time of the exile and the ending of the exile. were these gradual changes that went down to the first century of the Common Era, the first century AD. The Jews believed that God's administration of the world continued. There was a just system of rewards and punishments in this world, and also that each individual faced judgment and life after death. The primary post-biblical focus of Judaism was the temple up until 70 of the Common Era, 70 AD. At that point when the temple was destroyed, it no longer obviously was the primary focus. Then the gradual rise in importance of the synagogue and the decentralization of Jewish religious life. Judaism was focused in the temple for the longest time, but the destruction of the temple changed all of that. There is the year 70, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and all that has been left is the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, which still stands and gives you an idea of how massive that temple really was. There were a series of rebellions that followed, Jewish rebellions, and in 73 to 74 AD, there was a mass suicide of zealot defenders at Masada, and therefore there is now a permanent Jewish diaspora. And sadly, much of the scripture was lost during all of this. A long period of time ensued, which we will talk about next week. But the nation of Israel was not reestablished until 1948, in which a Jewish homeland was set aside. In the spring of 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered or rediscovered by a young Bedouin shepherd. And these were so important emotionally for the Jewish people and the Christian people alike, but especially important to Jewish scholars. With these Dead Sea Scrolls, we could have text to books written that were 1,000 years older than the earliest things that we had at that time. With the destruction of the temple, though, Judaism evolved from a religion of faith, of the sacrifice of animals in the temple, to a religion that was more about the book of Scripture and prayer. And that was a significant change, and we'll talk about how life unrolled during the 2,000 years up until this present time. Thank you so much. God bless you.